Okay, so today's lecture is about what I'm calling the long 1960s and the ends of Christian Britain. But I want to start by just saying something about my relationship to the 1960s, because it was the decade in which I'm born and to which I have a pretty much love-hate relationship with. So everything that you're going to hear today comes from that rather ambivalent, my rather ambivalent position to it. And I'm ambivalent, I think, for a couple of reasons. The first is that as a historian, I'm not much taken by the history of decades. The study of specific decades has become endemic to, particularly to the study of the 20th century. And the idea is that you can capture a particular mood or aura of a historical moment by decade. But that is, if you think about it for very long at all, that's clearly an absurd idea. The forces of historical change don't work in 10-year cycles. So in fact, studying decades looks like a very arbitrary a way of shaping the chronology of any type of study. And really one of the key things that I'm going to be trying to get across to you today is that the changes that I'm interested in talking to you about today that happened in the 60s actually had their roots in, many of them had their roots in the 1950s, and many of them also don't fully develop until the 1970s, hence this rather clumsy idea of the long 1960s. In fact, I would suggest that the very idea of the 1960s as a particular historical moment is itself a product of the revolt against it, and probably most famously represented in the critiques of the permissive era developed by Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in California and the US. So in some ways, this idea of the 60s comes from its critics more than from the proponents of the developments of that time. So there's an ambivalence about the study of decades, but there's also an ambivalence just because of my own historical situation. As I said, I was born in the 1960s, but I basically came of age in the post-punk generation, where we would routinely chant death to hippies. I mean, it was the hippie generation that we greatly detested. And we detested them not just because they had crap music, which I think is, unquestionably the case, but because of their general disengagement from social life. Or rather, the idea that seemed to be very important to this notion of the 1960s, of the development of alternative forms of politics and of culture and of lifestyle that would form a new type of ground for emancipation, for personal emancipation in particular. And for my generation, that dream of emancipation seemed like a chimera, seemed like an impossible thing. Hence, the parade of endless white, miserable men playing guitars that you have encountered every time you've come into this room. And yet, what I want to do is try and take seriously what the 60s represented as a type of revolt and how important that was for the transformation of Britain. I played the Who's My Generation this morning because I see the 60s and the story that I want to tell about the 60s as primarily the revolt of a particular generation. It's really about the coming of age of youth culture and youth politics and the transformations that put in place. And the key theme really was that the past was no longer going to be the guide to the future. There is, I think, a powerful critique of the paternalism that ran through both the ancien regime and through liberalism and through the technocratic forms of expertise of the social democratic state. And in this critique of paternalism, of this endemic strand of paternalism that runs through British history from the beginning of this course to this moment, one of the key criticisms, of course, of it is that it was blind to the politics and the experience of youth, of gender, of sexuality, and of race. So the 60s I'm going to talk to you about then is this generational revolt that tries to discard this deep, lurking, lingering paternalism in British politics and society. Now, the emergence and politicization of youth culture during the 1960s was not, of course, unique to Britain. It was very much a transnational process. We can see the emergence of new commodified forms of youth culture in many parts of the world, particularly, of course, in the US from the 1950s. We can see also the political mobilization of students across America during the 1960s. We can see the interest in civil rights taking place across many countries at this moment. And of course, we can see also the growth of a so-called third wave of feminism also occurring across Europe and the US. And this would also be true of the new forms of black nationalism that emerge at this time. What I'm going to try and do today, though, is not go over those familiar stories, because students of Berkeley, God forbid, don't need to be told anything more about the 1960s. It's inscribed in the very campus that we circle around. What I want to do instead is to give you a sense of the peculiar character of the 1960s as a youthful revolt, as a generational revolt in Britain. It wasn't, I think, it didn't occur on anything like the same scale as it did in France or in the US. But I think it was no less influential for that. And one flavour of this peculiar nature of the 60s in Britain was, of course, its drawing on Britain's own indigenous radical tradition. So it's no accident that this issue of the Black Dwarf, which was a radical leftist magazine set up in 1968 and runs through to 1972, took its name from the radical newspaper of that name that had been formed in 1817, that formed a key place for criticisms, for the development of the radical movement and of criticisms of the Peterloo massacre, and ran through to the 1820s. So there are one element of this peculiarity is this reach back to indigenous forms of history that could reanimate radical politics during Britain's 1960s. But the real peculiar character I'm going to suggest is the relationship of this revolt to the forms of social democracy that had emerged during the decades after the Second World War. And the real question is whether it represented a critique of social democracy or an extension of its radical promise. Whether what the radical youth politics of the 1960s were trying to hold true to social democracy, but extend its universal promises in ways that they felt had been compromised. Now, a couple of things that I want to highlight now that will run through the entire lecture. The first is this theme of paternalism and elitism. I've been trying to suggest to you in the last few lectures that social democracy in Britain was not of the people, it was for the people. That it was very much a paternalist project created by the new forms of technocratic expertise that had emerged and come to be dominant in the 1940s and the 1950s and 1960s. And that these people, this revolution, had been presided over by what I called last week the intellectual aristocracy, an upper middle class intellectual group of intellectuals, and their fusion with the old forms of aristocratic elite power. In a way, we can also think, we have to remember the centrality of the family too. The family is, of course, the sort of ground zero of paternalism. It's the very basis of the organization of paternal authority, with the male head of household ruling over the women and children. And we must remember that that idea of the family, which in many ways takes particular type of shape in the early 19th century, is reconsolidated in the decades after the Second World War. So this paternalism isn't just an elite political formation. I'm also suggesting that it runs through and structures everyday life in people's families. But I'm also going to be indicating to you today that the counterculture that emerges in the 1960s actually reinscribes a new type of cultural elitism. In many ways, it comes out of some of the critiques of mass culture and the idea that you can have an elite vanguard that would transform culture in more progressive dimensions. Another key theme of this lecture is the idea of the end of the Victorian moral code, whether the 1960s represent the moment when the forms of Christian authority and of the authority of the Anglican Church that had been so cemented during the liberal era, when the Church of England is re-energized by the evangelical revival, whether its forms of moral authority are finally laid to rest in the decades of the 1960s, that people no longer look to the Anglican Church as the sort of moral guardian of the nation. And then the third thing that I'm going to be talking about throughout today is the idea that, of trying to point to the way in which culture becomes a new ground of politics. This isn't really new. I've been talking about critiques of mass culture for a number of weeks now. But what we have instead is the idea of culture forming the basis of new counter-publics, new types of counter-culture that would give rise to new forms of identity politics, whether that's around feminism, whether it's about new forms of sexuality, whether it's about the politics of youth or race. And all of these refuse not just old-style leftist politics, but they also refuse the centrality of the state that had been so firmly established in the social democratic system. So in short, what I'm basically going to be saying to you is that the peculiar character of the 1960s in Britain is in many ways a product of the entire historical sequence that I've been trying to talk to you about throughout this class. And I think this should become apparent. I hope it will become apparent as the lecture progresses. Okay, so let's move on to the end of deference. Now, let's begin by reminding you again of how the Anglican Church had been one of the central pillars of the Ancien regime in Britain's 18th century. How that Anglican Church had in many ways been rescued by the evangelical revival that Methodism began in the middle of the 18th century, and how it became cemented during the 19th century as the key form of moral authority for the population at large, with, of course, the monarchy remaining, as it had been since the Glorious Revolution, as the head of the Anglican congregation. Now, one of the key issues that we have to grapple with today is how the influence of the Anglican Church begins to recede. You'll remember that there have been many, many anxieties about the declining grasp of the Anglican Church in the 19th century. That the so-called religious census of 1851 had shown how few working class inhabitants of cities attended the church. And there had been a continuing debate throughout the second half of the 19th century about the disappearance of, or the declining numbers of attending church. But it's also the case that the church continued to play a central role in marking the key rites of passage in people's lives. So one of the two important figures that you need to get here is that in 1972, 70% of people were still getting married in the Church of England, and 60% of people were still getting baptized in that church in 1956. Okay, so even at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s, you see that the church still has a very central role in the key moments where people mark the passage of life. What you can also see in these figures is that it's in the decades following the 60s that these drop quite severely. So by 1997, 39% of people were getting married in the Anglican Church, and by 1981, just 36% of the population were getting baptized there. But it wasn't just about the declining role that the church played at these key moments in people's lives. It was also about the degree to which the church had provided the moral framework around which the Victorian moral code had been established. Remember all of those campaigns to do away with all of the bad things like gambling and violence against animals and drink and all of that type of stuff. And you can see that one of the key developments in the 60s is a wave of so-called permissive legislation. Permissive in the sense that it seemed to relax that old Victorian moral code. Gambling is legalized in 1960. The death penalty is abolished in 1965. In 1967, you have the decriminalization of abortion and of homosexuality, on which more in a moment. You have divorce, the reform of the divorce laws in 1969. What you see in this image here, I think very importantly, is an argument between Lord Soper, who was an abolitionist, arguing for the abolition of the death penalty, and a member of the clergy who continued its support. Basically, in almost all of these issues, the Church of England was in favour of the retention, i.e. keeping the old form of legislation, not their abolition or reform. So the Church of England is in many ways on the wrong side of this movement to a more progressive or so-called permissive series of reforms. It wasn't just, of course, the declining place of the Anglican Church in everyday lives of Britons. What you also have in terms of this, the end of deference, is a growing suspicion or a growing awareness of the hypocrisy of the ruling class and of their own moral frameworks. So there is a rejection, very importantly, of the idea that the old ruling classes, that people should be deferential to those old ruling classes and to the moral frameworks that they had kept going. So 1963 is a really big moment here because it's the moment where two important events happen. The first, as you can see from this image of a man reading Lady Chatterley's Lover on a train and two men beside him peering over his shoulder to try and read the dirty bits, it was the year of the Lady Chatterley trial. Lady Chatterley was, of course, the novel written by... Oh my God, how embarrassing. I'm complete. D.H. Lawrence, thank you. God, a moment of complete brain freeze. Was D.H. Lawrence's famous novel written around the First World War that had basically been kept out of publication for its obscene bits, or rather there had been abridged versions of it that had passed the censorship laws. In 1963, Penguin try and publish a full edition of the book, which you'll remember is all about not just the sexual awakening of the aristocratic Constance Chatterley, but her sexual awakening at the hands of her gamekeeper. So not only do you have a woman discovering her sexuality, but you have it by a member of an aristocratic woman doing it at the hands of a member of the working class. The trial became famous because the chief prosecutor at that trial asked at the jurors if it was the kind of book that you would want your wife or servants to read. And this, of course, the Penguin's defense team leapt upon as showing how out of touch the establishment were, that people really genuinely believed that most people still had servants, or that men should be prescribing to their wives what they should read. The other big event of 1963 was the Profumo affair. Profumo was the Conservative Secretary of State for War, and he was exposed in the press as having an affair with a cool girl called Christine Keeler, who was reputed to be the mistress of a Soviet naval attaché that was widely understood to be a Russian spy. Profumo's big error here was to deny the fact that this affair had taken place in the House of Commons. And then, of course, the press had a field day showing him that that was a lie, and he was forced to resign by June. It was a key moment in the destabilization of the Conservative government. And a few months later, in October, Harold Macmillan resigns on the grounds of ill health. But most people had the very profound sense in 1963 that the Conservative government that had been in power for 13 years now seemed sort of morally compromised, that there was something rotten in the state of Hamburg. So the growing anxiety about this moral, these declining moral standards was also reflected in the rise of the increasing visibility and coverage of a series of violent crimes that almost became portrayed, so two of them became portrayed in almost heroic fashion. The first was the Great Train Robbery, where a massive amount of gold bullion was stolen from a train. And the other was the trial of the Kray brothers, a famous East End a crime gang in 1969. And in the middle of that was the infamous Moore murders in 1965, which was a big serial murder case propagated by a couple on young children. So there's a growing awareness here of a sort of laxity of moral standards reflected in these rise of violent crimes. The last component I want to talk about with this was the rise of comedy. The rise of comedy that was deeply satirical and was aimed primarily at lampooning the upper ruling classes of the country. And there are a whole series of these. The first was the Goon Show that began in 1951 and ran through the 1960s to 1960. Second was the launch of Private Eye, the satirical magazine still going, in 1961. TV program called That Was the Week That Was in 1962, and then probably the only one that you'll recognize of all of this, the beginning of Monty Python in 1969. All of these comedy programs, to lesser or greater degrees, tried to demonstrate the absurdity of the old paternalist structures of authority and the sort of conservatism of an older generation. And I'm going to just play you a clip of Monty Python in order to try and get this across. Okay, I'm afraid I have a lot to get on with, so much as I could watch Monty Python all day. There is, of course, a reaction to all of this. I mean, it's unimaginable that sketch could have been made even a decade earlier, such as its irreverence to the aristocracy. But there's a reaction which is not so much a defense of the aristocracy as a defense of this moral code, of this Victorian moral code. And it comes in many forms, but the best illustration of it for our purposes, I think, is the so-called Festival of Light, organized by a series of so-called moral guardians. And you see here probably the two most famous, Cliff Richard, the so-called rock star, and Mary Whitehouse, the campaigner for the cleanup of TV. Basically, they were against the proliferation of sex and violence in the mass media, which they thought reflected this collapse of the moral collapse of society. In 1970 and 1971, they held a whole series of rallies around the country, culminating in a big rally in September of 1971 in Trafalgar Square, which reputedly attracted 10,000 people. So in other words, from the get-go, there is a sense of this decline of deference being wrapped up in these two key pillars of the old system, this ruling class and the Victorian moral code of the Anglican Church. Okay, so let's move on to the student movement, which I'm going to try and describe to you as a post-colonial protest. First thing that I want to say is remind you of what I was saying a couple of weeks ago, I think last week, was that one of the key things about the new forms of politics that emerged in the post-war period was the increasing prevalence of so-called non-governmental organizations, and how many of these non-governmental organizations increasingly concern themselves with so-called international issues that exceeded the nation state. And probably now we think of them most as being associated with the rise of human rights and of the environmental movement. I'm going to give you the example of Amnesty International, which was formed in 1961, but had its roots in the work of its founder, Peter Benenson, in South Africa in the late 1950s, when he was set up an organization to monitor the treason trials of the African National Congress's leader, Nelson Mandela, at that moment. In other words, Amnesty began as being concerned with the position of political prisoners in the British Empire, and indeed actually in the former Portuguese Empire. So in other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is there is a new interest and awareness with international affairs that has a very strong anti-imperial flavor at the beginning. And I think that you can see this also in the development of the New Left in Britain and its role in the student protests of the late 1960s. In fact, students have been increasingly politically active since the late 1950s, when many of them had been involved in the supporting the campaign for nuclear disarmament and marching to Aldermaston. And in the middle of the 60s, especially, were in protest against the Vietnam War. There were also a lot of protests around the British presence British influence in its former African colonies, both in South Africa in terms of protests against the apartheid, the system of apartheid, and about Rhodesia. Indeed, the first sit-in at the London School of Economics in 1967 had been against the appointment of Walter Adams, who had been a chancellor at Rhodesia's main university, and he became appointed as the director of the LSE. Worse still, Adams had actually supported the Prime Minister of Rhodesia's, Ian Smith's, Declaration of Independence from Britain in 1965, which was a declaration of independence designed to try and maintain the continuation of the white settler rule over the majority African population. But the real student protests began in 1967 in the London School of Economics, and they spread to places like the University of Essex and Manchester in 1968. Key figures in these student protest movements are themselves post-colonial intellectuals. Probably the most famous is Tariq Ali, who had been born and raised in Lahore, went to University of Oxford, became head of the student union there in 1965, went on to be one of the big editors of Black Dwarf from 1968, alongside Sheila Rowbottom, who becomes an important figure in the feminist movement, as we'll see in a little bit. Another key figure here is Stuart Hall, who had moved to the UK from Jamaica in 1951 as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, and became, as we saw last week, a key figure in the development of cultural studies at the University of Birmingham, and a key intellectual in the New Left around figures like Edward Thompson as well. And finally, there are these two people that you see in this image behind me, which is from the LSE, the London School of Economics protest in '67, which is Vinay Chad and Bhaskar Vashki, both of whom were part of the Socialist Society at the London School of Economics, and both of whom had, Vashki had been a leader of the Students' Union at the University of Salisbury in Rhodesia, where Adams had been appointed. So in other words, the empire, or the ends of empire, have a really important role, I think, in the development of student protest in Britain. So too does the imperial or colonial position of Northern Ireland. If you're looking for something that looks like the civil rights movement in Britain, it happens in Northern Ireland. Remember that Ireland had been divided by the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1922 into not two halves, into South and Northern Ireland. And in the north of Ireland, which remained under British rule, there was a 2/3 majority Protestant population and a 1/3 minority Catholic population. It was the movement to establish civil rights for the Catholic minority that I think comes closest to the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US. In 1968, the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association is formed, and it had 5 basic demands. One man, one vote through all of local government, the end of gerrymandering of electoral districts that enable Catholic majorities to be split, the end to discrimination in public housing and in jobs, and the disbandment of the B specials of the Ulster Constabulary, which many people viewed as a sectarian organisation populated by Protestants. So again, an important role of Britain's old empire in the animation of student politics and civil rights. Any questions before we get into sex? The disbandment of the B specials, which was this branch of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which was populated basically by Protestants. So I'm going to start with this man.
Annus Mirabilis. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. Up till then, there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then, all at once, the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me. Between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP.
So this is Philip Larkin's famous poem, Annus Mirabilis, about the beginning of sexual intercourse in 1963. And sexual intercourse begins in 1963 for Larkin because it's the iconic moment where the contraceptive pill for women is commercially marketed. The key point that I want to get across to you here in this section of the lecture is that this is another great illustration of the fact that many of the processes of change that we associate with the 60s happened earlier, and many of them weren't entirely emancipative in their outcomes. So keep that in mind as we go through. In fact, Philip Larkin had really got it wrong. The pill had been available to married women only from 1961. It was only available to non-married women from 1967. Nonetheless, between 1962 and 1969, the numbers of users rose from 50,000 to 1 million. So this clearly is the decade in which women's contraception becomes more reliable and at wider spread. But that has, I'm going to suggest, contradictory implications. It's not just about the emancipation of women from their reproductive functions. The other story that is slightly contradictory is the story of the decriminalization of homosexuality for men, which begins with this report known, headed by Lord Wolfenden, that was a commission that was held between 1954 and 1957. And it began not as an attempt to decriminalize homosexuality, it began as a commission concerned with the problem of policing homosexual sex in Britain's cities. What it was basically concerned with was the fact that policing seemed to have failed to reduce the amount of public soliciting, especially in London. And so what the Wolfenden report does, very interestingly, is basically map all of gay London, all of the key sites of sort of cottaging and soliciting in London. And what it ends up doing is proposing decriminalization in order to try and get these types of homosexual male encounters off the streets, to basically put them where they believe they should be, which was indoors in private. That was the recommendation of the Wolfenden report. In fact, decriminalization doesn't happen, as we've already seen, until 1967. And if you lived in Scotland, it doesn't actually happen until 1980. And, of course, decriminalization was only for men over 21, whereas the age of consent for heterosexual relations was 16. Nonetheless, the age of consent for homosexual men was reduced to 18 in 1994, and then finally to the same age as heterosexuals in 2000. I suggested earlier that the pill had sometimes contradictory consequences. And I think a key element of the so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s was the commodification of sex, and especially the sort of licensing of male heterosexual pleasure. This actually, I think, is really nicely illustrated in the development of Soho in London as a sort of commercial sexual space, which happens really during the 1950s with a whole series of strip clubs and sort of backstreet brothels emerging in effectively in coordination with the Metropolitan Police Force, who were taking bribes from the owners of these clubs. But it becomes iconically represented by the establishment, of course, of the Playboy Club. Somehow, the Playboy Club becomes a way of cementing the newfound respectability of not just Soho, but of the commercialization of sex. Another great example of this, I think, is the enormous popularity of the publication The Joy of Sex, which was the one book on my parents' shelf that I actually read as a kid. It was published in 1972, and it sold 12 million copies, outstripping even those publications that we talked about in the 1920s, like Married Love and Ideal Marriage. The interesting thing about The Joy of Sex was that the emphasis was not placed, as Marie Stopes had been, on the endless quest for the mutual orgasm. It was much more a book designed to show the variety of sexual positions that men and women could engage in. And it was written by an interesting figure known as Alex Comfort, who was an anarchist and a pacifist. He had been a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, as well as a medical doctor. The other part of this commercialization of sex was, of course, the transformation of women's fashion and of the ideal body type for women. Effectively, what the big transformation of this era was the shift from what is best illustrated, I think, by Elizabeth Taylor, that rounded, voluptuous body of Elizabeth Taylor that many people thought was, the perfect sign of the mother in waiting, to a more to the figure of Twiggy. Twiggy, who became the Daily Express's Face of the Year in 1966, a new image of women as a figure of men's sexual attraction, and a whole new cast of clothing designed for this new, slight, feminine body. Okay, I'm going to talk now about the responses to this, okay, which of course was the growth of so-called third wave feminism, which in a way rises as a critique of many of these processes. Again, third wave feminism had a very transnational flavor. Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex came out in France in 1949. Betty Friedan's Feminist Mystique came out in the US in 1963. Okay, but feminism in Britain, again, has its own particular flavor, and again, that flavor turns, I think, in important ways to the critique of the forms of the welfare state of the post-war period. A critique of the forms of domesticity inscribed in the welfare regime set up after the war, a critique of the sexualization of women during the 1960s, and the continuing exclusions of women in the politics of class that many women experienced during the New Left politics and the student movements of the late 1960s. Indeed, in many ways, the third wave feminism in Britain emerges out of a critique of these of the student movement and of New Left politics, which they argued aggravated the oppression of women because it was so uninterested in it. Key figure here in the British context is Sheila Rowbottom, one of the editors of Black Dwarf alongside Tariq Ali. And in 1969, she publishes Women's Liberation and the New Politics. It's followed the following year by Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. Greer is also a type of post-colonial intellectual. She moved to the UK in the middle of the 1960s from Sydney, Australia. She went to study at the University of Cambridge and wrote for Private Eye. I should have said in the stuff about comedy, almost all of those comedy shows came out of student dramatic organisations at the University of Cambridge or the University of Oxford. In other words, the very people critiquing the paternalism and the absurdity of the traditional ruling class in many ways came out of that same gentlemanly formation. You know, they came out of Oxford and Cambridge and they went to work at the BBC. You know, they were absolutely as much a part of the so-called intellectual aristocracy as anyone else. But the big moment in British feminism was the Miss World protest in 1970 at the Royal Albert Hall. And I'm going to have to play you this, just when you think you couldn't get any lower. And their big slogan was, "We're not beautiful, we're not ugly, we're angry." This is a cattle market. You know, this is a denigration of women. No matter how many brilliant books were written, it was this major protest and a sort of global televisual event that really launched the women's liberation movement in Britain. Yeah.
Was that a staged protest?
No, it was an actual protest. It's not part of the act. It was an actual protest. The Women's Liberation workshop that happened in 1970 came out of the History Workshop movement that I was talking to you about last week. It was held at Ruskin College, Oxford, as an outgrowth of the History Workshop conference, and it elaborated the key demands of the women's liberation movement, which was equal pay, equal education and job opportunities, free contraception and abortion on demand, and free 24-hour nurseries. But the much more radical component in many ways of the women's liberation movement was its development of new forms of politics. And a really great example of that was the emergence of so-called consciousness-raising groups, which had began in the US in 1968, began to take off in Britain in 1969. By 1971, there were 71 women's consciousness-raising groups. And the idea of these consciousness-raising groups was women would come together and share their experience, their individual experience, in order to better understand the collective conditions of women's oppression. Okay, so part of it was almost like an emotional support group, and part of it was an attempt to think politically and historically about the condition of women and the forms of politics that they should engage in. There were two key journals that came out of this movement. One was Shrew, which you see here. The other was Spare Rib, which is the front cover of which is on the table of contents of the lecture with John Cleese with his hand on a woman's backside. The other element of this was, of course, the attempt to discover women's historical position. And it's no coincidence that women's history emerges out of this movement. Sheila Rowbottom wrote Hidden from History, 300 Years of Women Oppression and the Fight Against It in 1973, and became really the sort of, the key architect of women's history in the UK. It was, though, quickly apparent that not all the women's liberation spoke with the same voice. That for many women looked at the women's liberation movement as being dominated by white women and often by white middle-class women. And it's in that contradistinction that the Brixton Black Women's Group emerges in 1973, emphasizing that they had their own distinct concerns, which was about the unique position of black women in British society and their greater need for things like childcare, health, and education, because they were battling racial discrimination as well as sexual oppression. The other movement of sexual liberation was, of course, the emergence of gay and lesbian politics in Britain. And again, in some ways, this develops in lockstep with the American story. Probably the clearest exception to that was the beginning of lesbian politics in the Lesbian Minorities Research Group, formed in 1963. This was a group of lesbian women who were subjects of the research of sexologists to try and understand the pathology of their condition. And these women began to founded a journal called Arena 3 in order to talk to each other about not just their experience of being subjects of sociological, sexological research, but also to try and share contacts and a discussion of what it meant to be a lesbian in British society, remembering that same-sex relations between women had never been decriminalised in Britain because it was thought to be such a hideous crime that no one could even dare to speak about it. If it was to be spoken about, it would encourage women to have sex with each other. So they faced their own particular set of predicaments. More importantly, in terms of the visibility of gay politics, was these two organisations, the campaign for the Committee of Homosexual Equality, formed in 1967 to reject the higher age of consent placed upon homosexual men by its decriminalisation, and the Gay Liberation Front, formed in 1970. The Gay Liberation Front basically took its inspiration from the sort of post-Stonewall politics emerging in New York and the US in 1969, and determined, unlike the campaign for homosexual equality, which had a very legalistic sort of constitutionalist role, the Gay Liberation Front wanted to put gay politics onto the street, to put gay men on the street and make them visible, and to raise the consciousness not just of other gay men and give them the courage to come out in the same way, but also to raise the consciousness of the British population as a whole. The first Gay Pride March in London took place in 1972, and it had the motto, out and proud. And about 700 men marched through London, as you can see here, alongside the campaign for the banner for the campaign of homosexual equality. Just as with the women's liberation movement, so with gay politics, a key part of the new political formation was to return to history, to animate the new, their new politics. And the key figure here was Geoffrey Weeks, whose book Coming Out, Homosexual Politics in Britain from the 19th Century to the Present, was published in 1977. I don't have time to play you that. Let me move on to the final section of this lecture. Actually, I should play you this because it's a good link. This is Tom Robinson's Glad to be Gay, which I remember very well as a kid in 1978. Okay, so you get the idea. This was like on the this is a song in the charts, on all the things. It was an amazing thing that gay politics was so visibly out, and even in the late 1970s, that seemed an incredibly powerful statement. And gay men singing about the continuing oppression that they received from police raids, and the treatment of the other verses go on to treat, regular people. Okay, let me finish up by talking about the music industry, effectively, which, of course, was absolutely central to the politics and culture of youth in the 1960s. But here, too, the story begins much earlier. I've titled this Rebels Without a Cause because, of course, of the great James Dean film after that name of 1955. I could have made an Elvis play, of course, because Elvis was incredibly influential in terms of the development of rock and roll in Britain. Britain got its own highly lame versions of Elvis, in the figure of Tommy Steele, who you see here, and the even lamer image of Cliff Richard, who came to fame in 1959 and was a huge star long before he joined the Festival of Light in 1971. The fact that you get a rock star campaigning for the cleaning up of TV, it says a lot about the early iterations of so-called rock and roll in Britain. This new musical culture was, of course, energized by the new types of publications. Melody Maker, the big music magazine, had been around since 1926, but the really important new kid on the block, so to speak, was the new Musical Express that came out in 1952, and Sounds magazine that was launched in 1970. The new Musical Express had a circulation over 200,000 by the end of the 1950s and had reached 500,000 in the early 1970s. So there was newspapers, magazines for kids to read about music. There were also new television shows because both the BBC and the ITV wanted to capture this so-called youth market. And the BBC launches 6-5 Special in 1957 and Pick of the Pops in 1962, which was still going strong when I was a kid. And ITV had its rival Oh Boy, all of which basically was playing the latest hits and had following the movements of songs in the charts. So if that was the domesticated, commercialized version of rock and roll, of the early forms of rock and roll, of course it came to prominence in the so-called style wars of the battles against mods and rockers that, of course, The Who is so fantastically summoned up in the film Quadrophenia, which if you haven't seen, I urge you to see, or even the film Tommy, in which The Who did the soundtrack to. These were effectively almost gang wars between two different groups of youth, mods and rockers, and they used in the middle of the 1960s to meet in rival groups, the rockers on their big motorbikes and the mods on their little Vespas, in the big seaside holiday resorts, most famously in Brighton, where there was the infamous Battle of Brighton in 1964. A huge violence between these two groups, fueled by an increasingly widespread drug culture. So drug culture in Britain, the relationship between young people and drugs doesn't come in the so-called psychedelic 60s. It actually comes out of the 1950s and early 1960s. And in many ways is a product, some people have suggested, of the actual presence of the National Health Service. The National Health Service had meant that you had pharmacies across the country that had copious supplies of Valium and amphetamines that were routinely broken into by young people and used on the black market. It was in response to this that a new Drugs Act was passed in 1964 to ban possession of speed without prescription, because there was a recognition that so much of the drugs were prescription drugs available through the National Health Service. The last thing I want to say about drugs, basically, is that in Britain, there really isn't the big LSD moment that there was here. Instead, we had the very sort of common cardinal drugs like grass and hash and magic mushrooms were probably the most psychedelic of them all. And it was reputed that there were sort of 2 million users of these drugs by 1970, and I would say that they were all under 30. So that's the sort of conventional music scene, so to speak. I want to talk now about the formation of an alternative music scene. And that really, takes a number of different forms, because the commercialized forms of youth music seem to be very anodyne to many people. The BBC has a continuing monopoly over broadcasting, doesn't set up Radio 1 until 1967. Radio 1 was the station that broadcasted young people's music. Instead, people listen to so-called pirate radios like Radio Luxembourg and Radio Caroline and Radio London. And these were broadcast from ships in the English Channel just outside of the jurisdiction of the British government. There's a quite funny film called The Boat That Rocked that came out a few years about life on these pirate radio stations. Many of the disc jockeys that came to fame in these pirate radio stations went on to become the leading DJs on Radio 1 in the 1970s and even the 1980s. The other thing, of course, was the development of free music festivals. And in the week of Coachella, it's like a good time to talk about this stuff, where once you could go to festivals free. So Woodstock, of course, had happened in 1969, and the British equivalent was Glastonbury, still going strong to this day. But there were a host of other free music festivals, as you can see from this flyer that was handed around at Glastonbury, where you have basically throughout the summer a whole series of sort of impromptu free festivals that people could attend and chill out to. There's a film of Glastonbury that was directed by Nicholas Road and produced by David Putnam, that came out in 1971, which you can watch on YouTube. It's very like... Sometimes when... I haven't got the stomach for it, I'm afraid, but I watch it because it's quite, it's very evocative, if you like that type of thing. I want instead, though, to talk about my childhood hero, who was a disc jockey on Radio 1, known as John Peel. And it was John Peel who, during the 1970s and 1980s, basically was the main conduit for independent music in Britain. He broadcast between 10 and 12 p.m. 5 days of the week. And the whole point of the show was to provide you with an alternative musical agenda than that had been played during the day, which was the big, popular, commercialized pop songs. John Peel basically launched almost every famous sort of indie act in Britain through the 70s and the 1980s. And he did it in relationship with the development of the proliferation of new independent labels. So for a long time in Britain, as in the US, EMI and Decca had basically a monopoly over the recording and publishing industry. And it wasn't really, although Island Records was formed in 1959, it wasn't really until the late 1970s that you have new independent labels like Rough Trade and Factory being formed. Now, the point that I want to make here is that John Peel, who comes out of pirate radio, tries, just like many of the other forms of counterculture that I've been talking about today, in a way reinscribes elitism. What he's doing is to say, look, commercial popular music is just dreadful, and that I have a higher aesthetic standard. I can guide you to more virtuous, more valuable forms of musical production. So he trades on the very exclusivity of and the very uncommercial nature of the music that he plays. And I think that's a very important element to his to that work. Okay. Let me wrap up. So a number of points just to reiterate. The first thing is to return to the silliness of history by decades. Clearly, what I've been talking to you about today is the revolt of a particular generation. Okay, and that revolt, I've suggested, starts earlier than 1960, and it lasts longer than at the end of 1969. It's also, I would say, a very uneven process. Most of the events that I've been talking about today were predominantly took place in and around London. London was really the key site for many of these new forms of politics and culture that emerge around young people in the 1960s. There are pockets that happen elsewhere, but primarily this is a metropolitan story. Where I grew up, for instance, and where my parents lived throughout the 1960s, very little of this culture was apparent, even though I was less than 100 miles from London. But the revolt of this generation was a revolt, I'm suggesting, against the paternalism that went through British society from the 18th century to the present, but had manifested itself most recently in the forms of social democracy and welfare capitalism of the post-war period. And we need to take those criticisms very seriously. That social democracy, as I have been at pains to emphasize in the last few weeks, despite its universal claims, did fundamentally leave out or neglect certain key sets of issues and demographics. And in many ways, you can see these youth revolts as a response to that. But I'm also trying to say to you that we shouldn't reify these new forms of counterculture. We shouldn't think, as the Berkeley campus is sometimes prone to do, that these people were giants that we can never replace. Because in Britain at least, and I would suspect this also applies to the US, in many ways these forms of counterculture I've tried to suggest were a product of commercialization that had run through youth culture from the 1950s, and were also tended to inscribe a new form of elitism that took their culture to be superior to other forms of popular culture. This was the point of counterculture, that it sat itself outside of what it considered to be the mainstream. And so in many ways what I'm trying to indicate here is that this elitism is not that dissimilar to the types of elite paternalism that the 60s is in revolt from. The last point I want to make in this longest of all long lectures was that the other key consequence of the 1960s was, I would suggest, the rise of a new type of identity politics around sex, gender, and race. And a key part of that type of identity politics, at least in its formation in the 60s and 1970s, was about personal emancipation. It was a rejection that the state, and particularly the social democratic state, could deliver emancipation. that alternative forms of mobilization and social organization were necessary to emancipate women, gays and lesbians, and Catholics in Northern Ireland or black nationalists on the mainland. So the key issue, I think, that this set of politics struggles with was how far those struggles were going to be about a broader social transformation than it was about an individual one. And I think if you want a singular example of that tension, think about the women's liberation movement. Determined to raise consciousness for individual women, and yet trying to raise their consciousness in ways that tried to theorize what it was that women had in common. What were the common things that oppressed women that they needed to escape from? And that tension between individual emancipation and collective emancipation is, I think, the main legacy of this moment of the 1960s. Thank you very much.